Every modern army has a weapon that becomes a symbol, for better or worse. For the United States, the M16 is forever tied to the jungles of Vietnam. For Britain, that dubious honor belongs to the L85 rifle, better known as the SA80. Conceived in the 1970s as the small arms for the 1980s, it was supposed to be a revolutionary leap forward, compact, accurate, and future-proof. What the troops got, however, was a weapon that could be more curse than blessing, at least in its early years. The L85 is a bullpup rifle, meaning the action and magazine sit behind the trigger. That layout allows a full-length barrel in a shorter overall package, a tempting advantage for troops fighting from vehicles or in tight urban streets. On paper, it was exactly the kind of forward-looking design NATO partners expected. In reality, the first service variant, the L85A1, became infamous for stoppages, flimsy magazines, and a reputation for letting down the very soldiers who needed it most. Yet, like the M16 before it, the SA80 would not die. Through painful fixes, industrial intervention, and years of soldier complaints, it evolved into the L85A2 and later A3, reliable, modernized rifles that British forces carried across Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. The story of the L85 is one of ambition colliding with industrial decline, of politics promises overriding technical realities, and of how trust, once broken between soldier and weapon, takes decades to repair. To understand why Britain ended up with the L85, you have to look at the state of British small arms in the 1970s. The standard infantry weapon was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, essentially a British-made FNFAL in 7.62 by 51mm NATO. It was powerful and accurate, but also long, heavy, and not exactly suited for the kind of mechanized or counterinsurgency warfare that was becoming the norm. By the late 1960s, Britain was already experimenting with lighter calibers and more compact rifles. This wasn't new ground. Back in the 1950s, British designers at Enfield had developed the 280 British cartridge and an advanced bullpup rifle, the EM2. It was ahead of its time, offering controllable automatic fire with a cartridge that balanced range and recoil. But NATO standardization forced Britain to shelve the EM2 in favor of the 7.62 NATO round, leaving the Army stuck with the L1A1 SLR. That decision left a long shadow, and when NATO later moved towards the 5.56mm in the 1970s, British planners saw an opportunity to revisit the bullpup concept. Thus was born the SA80 program, small arms for the 1980s. The idea was simple on paper: replace the aging L1A1 and Bren-based section weapons with a unified family of 5.56 rifles. The L85 would serve as the standard infantry rifle. The L86 light support weapon would provide sustained automatic fire, and cadet auxiliary versions would round out the family. All would share parts, ammunition, and handling. Politically, the program carried another weight, keeping Enfield's Royal Small Arms Factory relevant. By the 1970s, British small arms industry was in decline, and the SA80 was seen as both a military requirement and a lifeline for domestic arms production. This dual pressure, modernize the infantry and protect jobs, meant the rifle had to succeed, whether or not the underlying design and manufacturing base were ready. The concept was bold. A bullpup layout offered the holy grail of a short, maneuverable weapon with a full-length barrel, perfect for armored crews, paratroopers, and urban fighting. If the execution matched the ambition, the L85 could have been Britain's answer to the M16, futuristic, adaptable, and exportable. But the gap between what Enfield promised and what the soldiers received would soon become painfully clear. The L85 was supposed to be a showcase of British engineering, sleek, compact, and forward-looking. Its defining feature was the bullpup layout. By placing the magazine in action behind the trigger, the designers managed to squeeze a full 518mm barrel onto a rifle shorter than most carbines. For troops fighting from armored vehicles or clearing buildings in Belfast, that seemed like the perfect compromise. Long-range accuracy in a compact package. Mechanically, the L85 used a gas-operated system with a rotating bolt, not radically different from the AR-18 design it drew inspiration from. It fed from 30-round Stanag magazines, fired the standard 5.56x45 NATO cartridge, and cycled at a moderate rate of fire. The rifle was issued with the SUSAT, Sight Unit Small Arms Trilux, a 4x optic that gave British soldiers an edge in aimed fire compared to the iron-sighted rifles many NATO allies were still using. At least on paper, the package looked ahead of its time. But the Bullpup design came with trade-offs. Reloading was slower and more awkward. Magazines had to be rocked into place at the shooter's shoulder rather than swapped directly in front of the trigger. The charging handle was stiff and not easily manipulated under stress. Left-handed shooters were out of luck entirely, since the ejection port spat brass directly across their faces. Trigger pull, another common Bullpup complaint, suffered from a long mechanical linkage that gave it a mushy feel compared to conventional rifles. Weight was another issue. Despite being shorter than the American M16, the L85A1 tipped the scales at around 4.3 kilograms, or 9.5 pounds unloaded, making it one of the heaviest 5.56 rifles of its generation. Once loaded with optics, magazines, and accessories, soldiers were carrying a rifle closer in heft to the old 7.62 L1A1 than to the lightweight assault rifle they'd been promised. The companion weapon, the L86 light support weapon, stretched the design onto a longer-barreled, bipod-equipped section automatic rifle. While accurate, it was too heavy and awkward to replace the Bren gun or even the FN Mini-Me, leaving it stranded as an odd niche between designated marksman rifle and squad automatic weapon. On the positive side, when the rifle worked, it was accurate. The full-length barrel combined with the SUSAT optic allowed British troops to deliver precise fire at ranges where shorter-barreled carbines lost energy and accuracy. In marksmanship competitions, the L85 often impressed. In field conditions, however, reliability would prove to be its Achilles heel. When the L85A1 officially entered service in the mid-1980s, the Ministry of Defense touted it as a triumph of British innovation. Troops, on the other hand, quickly learned that the rifle was more fragile than its reputation. On the parade square, the rifle looked sharp. In the mud and sand, it became a liability. The first cracks appeared during training. Soldiers reported frequent stoppages, double feeds, and failures to extract. The magazines, cheaply made and often out of spec, were notorious for causing misfeeds. Dust covers failed to keep grit out, and the weapon's internal parts didn't tolerate dirt well. Even minor bumps could knock the zero off the SUSAT sight. Troops joked that the A1 didn't stand for first model, but for always jamming. These weren't just gripes from the barracks. In the Gulf War of 1990-91, Operation Granby put the L85A1 into its first major combat deployment. Desert sand proved merciless. Reports filtered back of British troops struggling to keep their rifles running, with stoppages occurring in firefights despite rigorous cleaning. In some units, soldiers expressed open preference for captured AKs or US-supplied M16s. A damning verdict for a rifle that had only recently been introduced. Northern Ireland also provided a harsh proving ground. Urban patrols and rural operations exposed more flaws. Sluggish handling in ambushes, awkward reloading under stress, and the impossibility of safe left shoulder firing in tight corners. Troops trained to adapt, but they knew the rifle wasn't forgiving of mistakes. Behind the scenes, officers and engineers tried to downplay the extent of the problems. Official reports often soften the language, calling malfunctions teething issues that could be fixed with incremental improvements. The reality in the field was far grimmer. Soldiers carried cleaning kits as if they were life support, and many developed complex rituals to coax reliability from their rifles. Trust, the intangible bond between soldier and weapon, was badly eroded. Weight compounded the frustrations. At over 4 kilograms unloaded, the L85 was heavier than many full-sized rifles in service elsewhere. Add body armor, magazines, and kit, and British infantry were among the most burdened NATO troops of the era. The rifle's short overall length was a benefit in vehicles and narrow streets, But when a soldier had to hump it across Afghan hills or Iraqi deserts, the heft was unmistakable. Public confidence took a hit as well. Stories of jamming rifles made it into the British press, sparking questions in Parliament about how such an expensive, long-delayed program could deliver such a flawed product. The SA80 was supposed to be Britain's leap into the modern era of infantry combat. Instead, it was a national embarrassment. And yet, the L85A1 was not without bright spots. When it fired, it was accurate, sometimes astonishingly so. Marksmanship units valued its long barrel and standard SUSAT optic, which gave British soldiers a precision edge over adversaries armed with iron-sighted AKs. In static firing ranges or clean conditions, the rifle could stack rounds neatly on target. Accuracy, however, is little comfort when reliability is in doubt. By the late 1990s, the SA80 program was in crisis. The L85A1 had earned a reputation as one of the least reliable rifles in NATO, and frontline troops had lost confidence in their primary weapon. Replacing it outright would have been politically humiliating and financially ruinous. Billions of pounds had already been sunk into the development and production. The Ministry of Defense needed a lifeline. That lifeline arrived, somewhat ironically, from Germany. At the time, Heckler Koch was owned by Royal Ordnance, itself under the umbrella of BAE Systems. The Ministry of Defense contracted H&K to perform a comprehensive rebuild of the L85 platform. This wasn't a token update or a cosmetic improvement. It was a ground-up engineering rescue mission. H&K's engineers tore the rifle apart, identified its weak points, and re-engineered critical components with German precision. The resulting L85A2 was effectively a new rifle dressed in old clothes. The bolt and carrier group were redesigned for strength and smoother cycling. The extractor and ejector were upgraded to improve reliability under fouling. New polymer magazines replaced the flimsy originals, drastically reducing misfeeds. Springs, pins, and tolerances were tightened across the board. Even the finish of the metalwork was improved to resist corrosion and wear. In total, more than 50 components were reworked. Testing told the story. The mean rounds between failure, the MRBF, a key metric of reliability, skyrocketed. The A2 could now compete with the best service rifles in NATO under desert, jungle, and Arctic conditions. For the first time in its troubled history, the SA80 was a weapon soldiers could trust. The timing could not have been more crucial. Britain was about to enter a period of sustained combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both theaters, the L85A2 proved its worth. Soldiers who had cursed the A1 grudgingly admitted that the A2 was a different animal. It still wasn't perfect, the weight remained an issue, and the Bullpup ergonomics never went away, but stoppages were no longer the norm. The rifle was finally reliable enough for modern war. By the 2010s, the Ministry of Defense launched the Midlife Improvement Program to extend the SA80's service life. This produced the L85A3, featuring a new free-floating handguard with full-length Picatinny rails, a new paint scheme for better camouflage, and weight reductions through the use of modern materials. The A3 also addressed heat dispersion, making it more comfortable to use with sustained fire. Paired with updated optics, ACOGs, LCANs, and red dot sights, the rifle was dragged into the 21st century. The irony wasn't lost on soldiers or the press. The all-British rifle that had once been a point of national pride only became truly effective after being rebuilt by Germans. Still, the end result was what mattered. The L85A2 and A3 proved themselves in Helmand's Green Zone, Basra's alleys, and countless dusty checkpoints where reliability could mean the difference between life and death. The SA80 story could have ended as a cautionary tale of industrial decline. Instead, thanks to the H&K rebuild, it became an object lesson in how even a troubled weapon can be salvaged with the right expertise. By the 2010s, British troops weren't clamoring to ditch their rifles. They were, for the first time in decades, quietly confident in them. On opposite sides of the Atlantic, two rifles became cautionary tales. In the 1960s, U.S. troops went to Vietnam with the M16. In the 1980s and 90s, British troops carried the L85A1. Both promised to be cutting-edge rifles, both let their soldiers down, and both required years of fixes, billions in investment, and cultural rehabilitation before they were accepted. The M16's problems are legendary. At its core, Eugene Stoner's design was solid, lightweight, accurate, and firing a high-velocity cartridge that offered controllable automatic fire. But decisions made in Washington undermined it. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's cost-cutting and efficiency measures changed ammunition specifications at the last moment. The new powder fouled the rifle badly, and the lack of chrome-lined chambers meant corrosion and stuck casings. Worse, troops weren't issued cleaning kits because the rifle was billed as self-cleaning. The result, jammed rifles in firefights, dead Americans in the jungle, and a wave of congressional hearings. The SA80 story is different in detail, but familiar in theme. Instead of one man's decree, it was systemic weakness. Enfield's Royal Small Arms Factory was underfunded, nearing closure, and struggling with quality control. Political pressure to keep jobs and prove Britain could field its own modern rifle led the Ministry of Defense to push the L85A1 into service before it was ready. Corners were cut on materials, tolerances were sloppy, and the magazines were cheap. The result? A rifle that was beautifully accurate on the range, but terrifyingly unreliable in combat. The M16's failures can be traced to civilian interference overriding sound engineering. The L85's failures were rooted in industrial decline and political stubbornness. Both rifles show that procurement decisions outside the design lab can doom a weapon's debut. Soldiers in both cases lost confidence quickly, and that intangible damage was as serious as the mechanical flaws. A soldier who doubts his rifle carries a weight heavier than any kit. For the M16, the fix was relatively quick. Chrome-lined chambers, proper powder, issued cleaning kits, and better training. The upgraded M16A1 was a different rifle, and over time it became one of the most widely used and respected assault rifles in the world. For the L85, the fix came later and more expensively. It required outside help. Heckler and Koch engineers were building the rifle into the L85A2 with over 50 redesigned parts. Only then did it achieve a reliability on par with its NATO peers. Later, the A3 upgrade modernized it further. In both cases, trust had to be earned back the hard way. Reliability had to be proven in the mud, sand, and blood of combat. For the M16, that was Vietnam and later Cold War deployments. For the L85, it was Iraq and Afghanistan. In both cases, decades later, the rifles once mocked as death traps had become reliable workhorses. The story is not about flawed guns so much as flawed systems. When political expediency, industrial protectionism, or civilian cost-cutting overrides soldier-first design and testing, it's the infantryman who pays the price. The parallel sagas of the M16 and the L85 prove that a rifle is never just steel and polymer. It's also bureaucracy, politics, and culture forged into a weapon. And if any link in that chain is weak, the troops will be the ones left holding the jammed result. The lessons are clear. First, cutting corners in testing to rush adoption is a false economy. The cost of retrofits dwarfed what through pre-fielding trials might have saved. Second, reputation matters. Once troops doubt their weapon, even a fixed version carries the stigma for years. Third, politics and procurement must serve the soldier first. Protecting factories or appeasing budgets cannot outweigh the battlefield reality that reliability is life. The SA80 has now been in British service for nearly 4 decades, longer than anyone in the 1980s would have imagined. The A2 rebuild kept it relevant through Iraq and Afghanistan, while the A3 upgrade gave it modern rails, optics compatibility, and a fresh coat of camouflage paint. Yet no amount of incremental improvement can hide the fact that the design is aging. The A3 is expected to keep the rifle in service into the early 2030s, but the Ministry of Defense is already looking ahead. The reality is that Britain, like many NATO allies, will eventually have to choose between sticking with the 5.56mm NATO in a new modular platform or following the US down the path of next-generation calibers like the 6.8mm being trialed in the new NGSW program. Future requirements will likely emphasize suppressor integration, improved ergonomics for both left and right-hand shooters, modular barrels for different mission profiles, and the ability to mount advanced optics and fire control systems. Several contenders have been floated informally, derivatives of the HK 416, 417 family, newer Bullpup designs, or even off-the-shelf conventional rifles like FN's SCAR or CZ's Bren 2. Whether Britain pursues a domestic design or joins an allied program will depend on both budget and politics, the same factors that shaped the SA80 in the first place. For the troops, the question is simple. Will the next rifle be something they can trust from day one? After the long shadow of the L85A1, that requirement looms larger than any NATO standardization chart or industrial subsidy. The SA80, once derided and now merely serviceable, has taught Britain a hard lesson. The next rifle must get it right the first time. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.